exploration of everything.
Just like if the universe was without light and we were blind,
Your time is limited, so don't waste it living so
If we were
fast.
blind, we would have never known it was dark. Human Flourishing
Flourishing Podcast.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Human Flourishing Podcast. Okay, so last weekend, Yetta and I took the boys on a 20-mile backpacking trip up a portion of the Appalachian Trail, which runs from Georgia all the way up to Maine. But the key here is that we were backpacking, not hiking. And there is a difference. For those who know, you know. But for those who don't know, hiking is more of a lighthearted jaunt through the wilderness unencumbered by anything more than like a day pack and some granola. While backpacking is shouldering like a 35 to 55 pound backpack with food and tents and first aid and stoves and headlamps and socks and, the kitchen sink basically the entire way. Suffice it to say, these activities are totally different things, hiking and backpacking, which we discovered all too well. But another thing that I discovered over the last couple of days is the massive difference between hikers and backpackers. Just as an example, the common sorts of things you might hear from a hiker and someone who has not gone backpacking is, 20 miles, that sounds like a, nice little hike, or, that sounds like a great way to kind of warm the boys up to, the idea of being outside and being outdoors. Or my personal favorite, that sounds pretty easy. I bet I could do that. Backpackers responded totally differently. Things like, wait, how many days did you do it in? And man, 20 miles is a good distance. Or how heavy was your pack? Or things like that. One of my favorite ones from backpackers was, wait, you took a 4-year-old on a 20-miler? And yeah, actually, Wes, our 4-year-old, did the 20 miles in 2 days, as did our 6-year-old, our 8-year-old, and our 10-year-old. I'll get back to that in a second. But why focus so much on this difference between the two responses, the responses between hikers and backpackers? I think because for me, it drew into really sharp relief something that I've been thinking about lately, which is that the struggles and experience of others seem weightless and easy if you haven't walked in their shoes and experienced the sort of weight that they're carrying. And I'll be honest, our backpacking trip with our 4 little boys sometimes almost felt insurmountable. I would, tend to want to exaggerate and say that we almost died, but as the average listener or reader of my newsletter would know, trying to be a mostly reputable endeavor here. And so, only the facts, ma'am. But there really were times that Yetta and I were both literally carrying the boys. I mean, mostly Yetta. There were times that we were carrying multiple backpacks besides ours. I mean, once again, mostly Yetta. And there were times that we felt like we couldn't go another step along the trail. Fine, mostly Wes and me, especially by the end of day 2. But there were a lot of other areas of discomfort on this hike. There I go. Backpacking trip. We ran into rattlesnakes. We got drenched in a 2-hour rainstorm that felt like a tsunami, fully with lightning and thunder. Our water filter broke halfway through day 2, and we basically had to decide whether to camp that night at the end of day 2 or to push an extra several miles and just finish the trip a day early. We ended up deciding to do that second option, and our thought process was, well, if we just push through the extra few miles at the end of day 2, we might be overexhausted, but at least we won't be dehydrated like if we camp out into day 3. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of struggle and a decent amount of kind of manageable risk when you take on something like a 20-miler with 4 kids. It reminds me, and I don't know why it reminds me, but it reminds me of the Robert Frost poem, 2 paths diverge in the woods, and I took the road less traveled by. But anyway, I digress. And this is not all to say that it was all struggling or difficulty. In fact, Yetta and I talked after the fact, and calculated that probably 80% of the journey was, a peaceful time, an enjoyable time where you're connecting with nature and experiencing, beautiful glades and incredible vistas and overlooks across the valleys that, were next to the trail. But I think this is really key. The beauty didn't negate the difficulty, and the difficulty didn't negate the beauty. In fact, they almost brought each other into sharper relief. And there really was difficulty. It was hard. I mean, it's so hard, in fact, that about 1/10 of a mile from the end of our journey in our destination at Harper's Ferry, I actually passed out, and we think it was because of dehydration. But we're glad that we did this trip. We're glad because we actually wanted the difficulty. We wanted to be stretched. And I think this goes back to a few years ago when Yetta and I both read a book called The Comfort Crisis. You might actually remember that I've mentioned this in former newsletters and in past conversations with people. But in The Comfort Crisis, the author Michael Easter explains how modern society, with all of its conveniences and systems, it's essentially removed discomfort. And the comfort that we now take for granted is honestly slowly killing us. In a lot of ways, we've eliminated most physical hardships that our ancestors faced. And it turns out that the more comfortable that we get as a society, the higher almost every category of social ill actually becomes. And those social ills are skyrocketing. Things like depression, substance abuse, suicide, violence, just general societal unrest, you name it. In short, we as a society have really traded one kind of hard for a different kind of hard. And paradoxically, the easier that our lives become in one category, physically, natural needs being met, basic health, safety, stuff like that, the harder life actually becomes in other categories. Mental health, social health, relational health. Loneliness is at an all-time high. And as I've thought about this, a new idea has emerged. I think that we as human beings have the opportunity to choose our own hard. Or, even more simply, I've often said, you choose your hard. And I'd really take it a step further and say that every person really already does choose the hard that they want. They just might not realize it yet. At this point, I think I could hear, a lot of people's objections, like, what are you talking about? Like, most people are handed difficulties and circumstances outside of their control, and they didn't choose their pain. And, first of all, I would say, anyone who makes that point is right. We are born into circumstances and struggle and difficulty that we don't choose and that we don't bring on ourselves. So we aren't choosing that. People often are handed, difficulties and, bum hands. You can think of, a lot of people who are born into foster care or who are homeless or are impoverished. You can think of minorities who face discrimination, around the world. You can think of people with health issues or, various sorts of diseases. I could go on and write a book about the sorts of difficulties that average people around the world might be born into that are outside of their control. But I could also write a book, I think, about people who've been born into those exact sort of circumstances and pulled themselves out of it, through determination and grit and hard work. In fact, my team at Distant Moon and I, we recently produced a documentary series about people just like that. We produced this with our friends at the American Enterprise Institute, and we featured real-life people who were born into abusive families and born via rape, or people who are marginalized and oppressed, people who could have blamed all their struggles on the life that they were given, but they didn't. Through hard work and grit and determination, they practiced something more powerful than resignation. They practiced agency, taking control of their life, accepting that the life situation that they were dealt was actually changeable, and didn't have to limit themselves to a hard life, but instead that they could regard, their difficult origins as a launch pad, something to fight against and to take a stand against, to pursue improvement, to choose hard work and to choose the harder path of saying, I don't accept the life that I've been born into. And that's a hard decision to make. But I think that it makes something really clear the more I've thought about that it's a hard path either way. These people, they took a stand. They pursued improvement, self-improvement. They pursued difficult work, and they still had hard lives. And if they hadn't done those things, they would have had hard lives. And I think that's the key. Both paths are hard. But I think if we choose our path of chosen difficulty, it gives us something more powerful than struggle. It gives us a sense of agency, a sense of being the master of our destinies, or at least partakers or co-creators in the opportunity to change our destinies. And that reminds me a lot of some really dear friends of mine, Alex and Brett Harris, who, when they were teenagers, they wrote the book called Do Hard Things. And the premise of this book was pretty simple. Teenagers don't actually want to live in a world of low expectations. Teenagers want more. They were built for challenges. And at the time that they wrote this in the early 2000s, this idea caught on like wildfire. It spawned a nationwide movement called the Revolution. They traveled all over the country, meeting, thousands and thousands of teenagers. And the movement lasted over a decade. And I think the movement was so powerful because it struck a chord. It struck on this desire that teenagers have that's inbuilt, this inbuilt desire for challenge, this inbuilt desire for agency that I think exists not in just teenage hearts, but in every human heart. And I think that's where this story comes full circle for all of us who either tell stories or try to communicate to supporters or clients or just other human beings in general. And I would say, if you don't fall into any of those categories, are you sure you're even alive? Because I think we all need to communicate to other human beings on serious issues and light issues, just as a course of our daily life. And if you're a human being, I think you have to ask, two questions. The first is the way that you're communicating appealing to the desire built into every human being for meaning? And then secondly, in the way that you're communicating, are you encouraging your audience to choose the better path of hard? Those two questions animate everything that the Distant Moon team and I have tried to undertake over the last few years. And I think the results speak for themselves. My team is not merely inspiring audiences to choose the hard path, the hard path that leads to human flourishing, and to avoid the hard path of just accepting frustration and stagnation in the cards that you were dealt. But we're also reinforcing and relearning for ourselves every single day that the chosen hard path is always preferable to the hard path that we receive from our circumstances. Oh, and that ham-fisted reference earlier to Robert Frost, taking that path is, I think, the path less taken. And that really has, like Robert Frost said, that really has made all the difference. Here's the Human Flourishing. Talk to you guys later.